Good evening, everybody. This is Steve with Real Progressives. Tonight is going to be a very special night. We normally dive into the widgets and the machinations of modern monetary theory, and we try to talk about different aspects of debt and deficits and how, in fact, to achieve what, in fact, the public purpose is. And we've said this over and over again. But the unfortunate thing about my stance is that I haven't defined the public purpose yet. In fact, I have some ideas, I have some thoughts, I have some ideas even, but they're not a cogent overall end-to-end what is the public purpose. So to help me make that definition very clear, I'm going to bring on my friend, author, economist, political scientist, and overall around good guy, Joe Firestone. Joe, come on board, sir. How are you today?
Fine, Steve. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, sir. So this subject, you brought this up to me when we were talking about what we were going to go through tonight. And I just want the audience to be aware that this is a multi-layered discussion. What we're doing tonight is going to tee up what I talk to Ellis Winningham tomorrow night about. And then it's going to, in fact, help facilitate the conversation that we have with Pavlina Cherneva on Monday, Martin Luther King Day, to discuss the job guarantee, etc. So with that, this is a very important conversation, I believe. I think understanding what it is that we're talking about in regular people terminology that helps people understand the space. Now, Joe, you have written quite a few books that have dealt in deep detail about what the public purpose is. So what I want you to do, if you don't mind, tell us, Joe, what is the public purpose?
Okay. First of all, the public purpose is an abstraction. Okay. It's something we use. It's a term we use to summarize the combination of our different purposes. So the public purpose is a multidimensional idea. Okay, what it addresses is the problem of taking all of the individual goals, objectives, and purposes that we have and somehow combining them into one summation, into one evaluation. And with respect to that evaluation, we would like to know whether a particular policy that's under consideration or a particular policy that has been passed or a particular decision which we're all considering, okay, and the political people are considering, we would like to know whether one decision will deliver a greater net benefit relative to public purpose than an alternative decision will.
So
that's the way I would start it off.
So let's talk about that for just a moment. When you look at the way our bills are currently thrown at us, it seems like people are throwing spaghetti at the wall. It doesn't seem like there's a rhyme or reason. It's like you're kind of going like this back and forth. There is no cogent sense of what it is to be serving the United States public purpose. If we understood that, it would be kind of like a bedrock springboard from where we go with defining all policies going forward, not just some policies, correct?
Yes, I think so. But we also have to recognize that there have always been concepts or ideas that speak to the notion of summarizing different things that are wrong with our present state and different goals and objectives and purposes that we would like to fulfill, okay, or like to reach. For example, the preamble to the Constitution refers to the general welfare. Okay, the general welfare is one such concept. Okay, sometimes in the area of foreign policy, people will talk about the national interest. Okay, and the national interest is another summary abstraction concept, of that kind. People will talk about the common good, and that is also such a concept. Now, the public purpose as a concept, the first time I heard that referred to, as opposed to the public interest, in other words, everybody hears about the public interest, but the first time I heard people talk about the public purpose was in John Kenneth Galbraith's book, Economics and the Public Purpose, which was written, I believe, if I recall correctly, back in 1973. And I don't know why he preferred the term public purpose as opposed to public interest, but it was a term that captured my imagination at the time. I thought it was a good way to refer to things, perhaps because the idea of purpose implies activity. It implies Americans or citizens trying to get somewhere, trying to improve their situation. And of course, to do that, they would have to have some purposes in mind, and they would have to want to accomplish those purposes. So that seemed to be a more active construct, than the national interest was. And so, either the national interest or the public interest. And so I became interested in thinking about the public purpose at that time. I didn't hear too many people talking about the public purpose for years and years and years. And then I ran into the MMT literature. Specifically, I ran into Warren's 7 Deadly Innocent fraud. And when I did, I found that in the book, he sort of kept referring to public purpose. This doesn't fit public purpose. That does fit public purpose. But he never defined public purpose in that book. He referred to it quite a few times, though. And so it was clear that he thought that perhaps pursuing MMT had some purpose, specifically the purpose of fulfilling the public purpose. So when I would read some of Stephanie's stuff, I would also see, when I heard her speak, I would also hear references to public purpose. In Bill Mitchell's work, I would find references to public purpose. And in Randy's work, and generally speaking, MMTers make some kind of bow or nod to public purpose when they're giving MMT presentations. But I haven't seen a lot of work from MMTers in general trying to discuss what the public purpose is at length and in its variegated aspects. And since, of course, it's a generalized abstraction, a summative type of concept, it has to have a lot of aspects or dimensions to it. So to understand its meaning, the first thing we have to do is to specify the dimensions of public purpose, the various aspects, of public purpose. So you might say that if someone performs a specification of the public purpose by listing and describing the dimensions, of public purpose, you might say that they're developing a theory of public purpose. And also, you might say that that particular theory has to do with what they think is important. It has to do with what their values are, what they think it's important to accomplish. what they think the goals and objectives of our society ought to be. And essentially, the dimensions that specify the goals and objectives and specify the public purpose, therefore involve value judgments, involve in the selection of the dimensions of public purpose. And people will disagree on what those dimensions are supposed to be. You will sit down and specify the dimensions, okay, of public purpose, and your list of dimensions and the way you describe them is likely to be somewhat different from my list of dimensions, or from Randy's list of dimensions, or Warren's list of dimensions. So people are going to differ on those dimensions. Now, if you go through the people who are not even progressives, who are conservatives, or who are neoliberals, okay, or who are old-style Republicans, their dimensions may be very different, okay, from our dimensions. And okay, I'm not going to say there's not one theory of public purpose that is a correct theory. It's interesting to speculate on what exactly is a correct theory. I'm not a relativist, so I don't believe that there is no one correct theory. But on the other hand, it's certainly very hard to decide, and one can never be certain about what is the correct theory. So it's like any other theory in the sciences. There's a question of correspondence to an overall standard of evaluation. In the case of facts, that standard, okay, of evaluation is perhaps correspondence to the truth. And in the area, okay, of value, it's probably correspondence to what ought to be. Okay, so I'm not claiming that my theory of public purpose corresponds to what ought to be. It's one theory, okay, of public purpose. But the way we arrive at consensus on such theories is by criticizing them, okay, arguing about them, but essentially deliberating about them. And over time, hopefully, if we're reasonably rational about the whole process, we may come to a convergence sufficient to agree on what the public purpose is for us, for a majority of Americans, perhaps, for the people in government, for the legislators. We can arrive at constructs of public purpose that we hold in common. So that's what a part of my work is about.
Is it an academic exercise, or is this something that could be codified into some sort of a document that is like an addendum to, say, said Constitution or something, or Second Bill of Rights? I mean, what I want to understand is this something we look to think tanks to tell us what our public purpose is, or is this just when I know you said it's an abstract, but is it an abstract construct in the sense that it doesn't really, there is no public stance, or is this something that?
Oh no.
Okay, so explain to me how this comes to be.
We use abstractions all the time.
Sure.
In other words, when people talk about some person has the power, or some person has influence. Power and influence are abstract concepts. Okay, we have to find ways of measuring them. So all humans use abstractions. It's perfectly commonsensical, okay, to use abstractions. The answer to your question, though, is that working out the meaning, okay, of public purpose certainly can be an academic exercise, and I think ought to be an academic exercise. But in today's world, you don't find many academics trying to figure that out, because they tend to stay away from, from normative theory these days, except of course for the philosophers. Yeah, but other than the philosophers, they stay away from normative theory.
So
Okay,
real quick, I want to
too
stop.
busy doing empirical theory. Hang on, okay, before you
Sure.
stop.
Okay.
Okay, but ordinary people do normative theories every day, all the time. They live according to normative theories. You and I live according to normative theories. We think through what we prefer, what our goals are going to be, what our purposes are going to be. We evaluate how close we are to our goals and objectives. And we do it all the time because everybody who has to make a decision does it. So in the area of public purpose, we as politically active people, what public purpose means to us and what the dimensions of public purpose are going to be. And that in turn is what stands behind our political agendas. So it's about formulating political agendas. We want to have political agendas that accord with what our notions of public purpose are. And we can't formulate such political agendas until we become clear on what public purpose is and what the dimensions of public purpose is.
Okay, so let me jump in for just a minute here because, I'm looking at the comments and things, and I'm trying to, our audience is of varied perspectives, varied, education backgrounds, and normative theory is something that you would read in a textbook. And I was just trying to get you to do a
term normative theory. The term normative theory is something you would read in a textbook. That's right.
So when we talk about defining the public purpose, I think to myself, okay, so you've got conservatives that live in a world of Calvinism that would derive an entirely different set of quote unquote public purpose based upon their worldview. And then you've got Democrats who really seem to be rudderless. They kind of just go with whatever their leaders tell them. And you have progressives who are truly grinded out, have a very, very revolutionary approach to it. And then you've got the far right. So it's like that spectrum thing, right? The center kind of goes with status quo. And it really is not really about changing anything. It's kind of like just maintaining, not changing, but maintaining. So as you go around the horseshoe, political spectrum wise, is this something that we all define for ourselves and then we bring it and then we see what the amalgam looks like at the point of policy? I want to try and make sure that we all understand it. So as we're proselytizing one another with economic theories, that we're also in the process of describing values and what the foundation for each of these, for each of our decisions we're making are.
Okay. I think the answer is we define it for ourselves. Some are more comprehensive about it, okay, than others are. In other words, there are varying degrees of thinking through all the different aspects of, of public purpose. We also come together and we discuss the different aspects of public purpose and debate the different aspects of public purpose. Okay, and yes, we do arrive at amalgams. Okay? And the amalgams among groups will often not really represent a consensus. They will represent, serious differences. But sometimes there's a consensus.
Okay. So
did I answer the question?
I think you did. I guess my point is this. When I sit there within the realm of real progressives, as long as I'm controlling the microphone, okay, we have a very defined public purpose. I'm driven to a public purpose. I have a set of ethos, a purpose-driven platform. It starts with economics, and then it comes down with leave no person struggling, unnecessarily needs-based. So that's my public purpose. As I define what would be good and what would be bad, I assess every single thing along the way through that lens. So I would consider that to be kind of a paradigm of what our values are. And so as I come outside of the hallowed halls of real progressives, I notice that people suddenly deviate significantly, wildly, in fact. So as we cater to the mean, it shows really, quite frankly, why the Democratic Party has survived the way it has and the Republican Party has survived the way they have, because they go ahead and live along the mean and they don't stray too far to the edges. And as we approach the edges, we're marginalized, and people tend to, talk about crazy and fanatic and extreme and this, that, and the other. But in reality, we have a different definition of what the public purpose is. So I guess what I'm trying to do is looking at, one, the Overton window, and two, our own personal ethos as it pertains to defining a larger public purpose definition. How do we take this concept, this abstract, and come together as a nation to create what the overall U.S. public purpose is? I mean, is that always a moving target? I mean, is there anything there that can help level set?
I think it is always a moving target, in the sense that we'll always be discussing the public purpose, and through critical analysis, we'll be changing our emphasis on various aspects of the public purpose, and also maybe on some of the dimensions of public purpose also. But to answer your question, the way we get to the public purpose, at least from time to time, is only through discussing it with each other, only through continuous critical analysis of it. And the fact that we're not going through this kind of critical analysis and this kind of discussion is a source of weakness and the ambiguity and the failure to develop consensus that is strong enough to break through, actually enact a progressive agenda. In other words, in a very real sense, sometimes we don't know what we're fighting for. Our ideas about what we're fighting for, yes, we may have specific notions. I'm fighting for full employment. I'm fighting for single payer. I'm fighting for basic income. I can specify various individual things that I'm fighting for. But whenever I start focusing on any of these things and I come to a specific policy to achieve them, I also have to consider the impact of that policy on a whole variety of other things. Let's take something we don't like, which is the policy of minimizing the debt to GDP ratio. All these politicians for years and years have been wanting to minimize, the debt to by GDP ratio. Even after a time when we have to deficit spend to do something good for the economy, very quickly they come back to, the debt to GDP ratio is getting out of control, and we got to bring it back under control. But their focus on the debt to GDP ratio as a central focus of policy doesn't appear to consider or to take into account what the side effects of pursuing that policy are going to be. I mean, what will happen as a result of the fact that I reduce the deficit from $1 trillion a year to $800 billion a year, to $600 billion a year, to $400 billion a year? What are the other consequences of that, other than just reducing things to $1 trillion, 800, 600, and so on? There is at each stage different side effects. There's no evidence these people consider those side effects. No, it's just the central focus is, or should be, on reducing the debt to GDP ratio, and the devil take the hindmost. That seems to be the attitude. And instead, I think we have to have the other attitude. We have to have an attitude that whatever policy you're considering, you have to consider the effect of that policy on the public purpose across the board, not just with respect to the single objective that you have in mind. What does it do to all the other objectives that you might have in mind, or that somebody else might have in mind?
Can we talk a little teeny bit about trade and income inequality as it pertains to the public purpose? This is a subject area that you are very, very well versed in. I think this might be a really good area just to kind of use as the example setting to demonstrate this concept, this abstract. Would you take a stab at that?
Sure. Okay. It seems that over the years, in emphasizing free trade policy, we've concluded these agreements, which purport to be free trade agreements and which are justified in terms of there being free trade agreements, which do all they can to protect the investments of people who invest in other countries. In other words, they're not simply trade agreements that are concerned with lowering tariffs, okay, or stuff like that, but they're agreements that try to make the governments of the world, regardless of the implications of such an objective, for equality in each country, for distribution of wealth in each country, for the creation of a globalization plutocracy. None of these side effects are considered. The only thing that's considered is we have to make the world safe for investors so trade can be free, so capital can be free to move. Okay, no consideration of the range of other values which are involved in trade. Okay. Furthermore, when you're concluding those types of trade agreements, what difference do they make for the sovereignty of the individual nations? Since national sovereignty is bound up with democracy in each of the individual nations also, insofar as the trade agreements are compromising sovereignty, they're also compromising democracy in each of the individual countries that are democracies. Because if your domestic legislation, your fiscal policies, your labor policies, the regulations you have are undermined by the trade agreements, the consent of the governed in your individual countries is also undermined. And democracies in the individual countries are also undermined, because to create policies that are wanted by the majority of people in each of these countries is to violate the trade agreements. So the will of the people has to give way to the trade agreements. Now, when people try to sell trade agreements, when they try to get the public to accept the trade agreements, what they talk about is the likely economic advantages of the trade agreements. But they never talk about the impact on democracy in each of the individual countries, or the impact on inequality in each of the individual countries. The trade agreements are not evaluated in terms of the benefits they deliver to public purpose across the board, looking at all the dimensions, okay, of public purpose. Did I answer your question there?
Oh, absolutely. That was beautiful, and it leads me to my next question. And I'm glad you used the term. We're talking about sovereignty, right? We have a purpose-driven public space where we talk about our sovereign nation. We talk about debt and deficits in terms of sovereignty. But
Yeah,
as we,
a purpose-driven public space that should be public purpose-driven,
yes, exactly, not private-driven, but exactly. So
not private purpose-driven, public purpose-driven. Private
exactly.
purpose-driven only to the extent that the private purpose is supportive of the public purpose.
That's right. So if we look around the world, one of the things somebody's asked me repeatedly, the United States wields its dollar hegemony, in X, Y, and Z fashion. It does not help out with the rest of the world. It ends up, quote unquote, enslaving the rest of the world. You bad people, you bad people. And I try and say, listen, by the same measure of evil that you've seen, performed by our plutocracy that we live in, is the same measure of goodness that we could do if we shifted it around. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The problem is we've never taken our power. And as you look around the world, you look and see countries like Greece that gave up their monetary sovereignty to the ECB, and therefore then in turn rendered moot the idea of a public purpose, because they can no longer execute a public purpose because they no longer have the means by which to push forward a public purpose because they gave up their monetary sovereignty. And these trade agreements oftentimes act as a de facto sovereign. The trade union is now the sovereign as opposed to the country as the sovereign. I mean, am I close to right with this? I mean, can you expound on that?
I think you are quite right about that. In fact, I think what the Greeks did was something they had no conception. In other words, they had no idea that what they were doing when they joined the EU was not simply to give up their monetary sovereignty, but in consequence to give up their democracy. But that is what has happened since 2010, since the crisis in 2010. The successive governments of Greece all have had, to knuckle under to what the Troika wants to do in Europe. They have not been able to represent the interests and the will of their countrymen. Even Syriza, which was elected to end austerity in Greece and to end the suffering in Greece, had to knuckle under to the Troika, because if they did not, the Troika would seize their banking system, make their whole financial system crash. And the Syriza leaders realized that would make the suffering of the population in Greece even worse. So they accepted slow strangulation rather than independence, freedom, democracy, and even worse suffering in the short run. That was the trade-off. And I think Syriza was aware that it was doing it, but it felt it had no choice in the end.
So
it didn't feel the Europeans would push them to that extent, but they did. They set out almost from the first week to undermine Syriza, even though they had a popular mandate. They just set out to overthrow the democracy and install what they wanted to install.
In my mind you, I'm a little bit of a radical in my own right. If there was ever a point in time where a just war could have come into play, what they've done to the Greek people is unconscionable. I mean, I'm never advocating for war, so we're on the same page here. But like out of all the wars that could have been fought, what the coup d'etat they did through economic policy in Greece is nothing short of evil. And I want to take that to our
Yeah,
own.
but it wasn't only through economic policy. Fundamentally, it was through financial policy.
Yes, yes.
Okay, it was the bank that did it. The ECB did it.
Well, they gave up their sovereignty to the ECB.
They
I
gave
mean,
up their sovereignty to the ECB, the IMF, and the European Commission.
sad. It's depressing.
Three parts of the troika.
So let me ask you, this is super important to me because I want our listeners to pay attention to this. They get thrown under the bus talking about Greece and the U.S., but in the U.S., we have our own Greek situation in Puerto Rico right now, where we have basically allowed a net importing, territory that has no means of its own to really produce enough goods and services to keep their balance of trade and thus be able to pay off their debts as a currency user. They are, in essence, Greece in the United States. So we have done this to our own people.
Absolutely.
It is revolting. Talk to me about this in not just in economic terms, but in terms of defining the public purpose as it relates to that. And we can even go into Detroit, and we can go into some of these cities within the country itself and discuss how our public purpose and their sovereignty, their ability to react has been just decimated by this idea of how we enact not only economic policy, but the fiscal policy of the United States and the public purpose driven behavior. I mean, this is neoliberalism attacking it, in my opinion. I'd like to hear your opinion on that, Joe.
Well, of course it is. I mean, the whole idea that it is not the responsibility of the government to respond, okay, to unemployment everywhere it occurs, okay, in our country, is something that is critical to ideas, okay, of public purpose. If your concept, okay, of public purpose, okay, involves seeing to it that there's always full employment, because perhaps the very existence of a national currency creates business cycles and less than full employment from time to time. And so you believe that it's the responsibility of the government that creates the currency to provision itself.
That's a term most people aren't going to think of.
To end unemployment. Then you're going to believe that the neoliberal policies, which don't accept that as a responsibility of the government, are not in accord with public purpose. You will disagree with them on what public purpose means.
Can you just do me a favor? The term, I know what you mean by the term, but I want to make sure our viewers know this is one of the main differentiators, I'm hoping, with what we do at Real Progressives than what you see in other places. There's a lot of jargon, and provision is a term that, while I understand it in terms of, like, hey, I'm provisioning a router or a switch, or I'm provisioning a whatever. Talk about provisioning the economy. Talk about how we use our own tools to provision the economy, what that means when you use that term.
Okay, what it means is, okay, it comes from the idea that when you have a government, or when you have a king, let's say, a monarch, okay, or any group of people, okay, who are running a government, then those people need goods and services from the population they rule so they can continue to perform their governing functions. In other words, the government needs things. It needs buildings. It needs soldiers. It needs food. It needs consultants. the specialists, of various kinds. How does it get those things? Okay. It hires people and it pays them currency. Okay. It gives them currency. Now, there are different ways to provision a government. One way is by force. In other words, the government can get what it needs simply by robbing the population through using force, just going and getting it, taking it, enslaving people. Okay? Now, that's the hard way. The easy way is to create a currency and make sure people need that currency by taxing them. Since people need the currency, they're going to want to get that currency from the government. And if they can get that currency from the government by providing things to the government, then that solves the provisioning problem for the government. So when the government actually provisions itself, it gets the things it needs and wants from the population by giving them currency.
Very good. Very good. Thank you, sir. So I got a question offline here, and I wanted to bring it up to you. For those of you who don't know Joe Firestone, you got to get to know Joe Firestone. He's written many books. He's written blogs all over the place. You don't have to look hard to find a Joe Firestone article. But one of the subject matters that Joe is expert in, and it plays into this public purpose role. Joe was absolutely instrumental in breaking down resistance to the various trade agreements like TPP. Now, as activists, etc., it's wonderful to be against something. It's wonderful to be for something. It's even more important to actually understand what the hell it is that you're fighting for. You really should, if you don't understand something, it's bad, and you trust the people you're hearing it from, okay, we need the support. Great. I mean, we do need numbers, right? Numbers matter. But it's more important, in my opinion, that you understand what it is we're fighting for. That way you can break it down to someone that is other than yourself, outside of the cocoon, and you can explain why we're fighting. So it doesn't just sound like you're some rabid, crazy person. You sound like somebody who actually understands what the dilemma is. So what I want you to talk to me about, Joe, just for a moment, if you don't mind, as long as we need, really, because I think it's very important going forward that people have the foundation of why we fought against the TPP, what the TPP stood for, and what all the other little tissa, this is that came with it, and why they were put in place, and how they tried to package this gold standard of nonsense into some viable thing. Can you talk about that? I know it's a little bit historical in the fact that we did temporarily, at least, knock it down. It sounds like this is going to always happen, isn't it?
I don't know if it'll always happen with respect to the trade agreements, because it may be that Trump will develop a different standard for trade agreements, and that we'll be seeing that actually fairly soon. The free trade game, though, seems to be up. What that game was about was people were using a theory that seemed to show that free trade was always beneficial to nations, which came out of the work of David Ricardo in the early part of the 19th century. Okay, and Ricardo purported to show in the two-nation case that when there were no trade barriers between the nations, there were gains to both nations in terms of the well-being of the citizens, because they were able to receive the goods, okay, of both nations in a larger quantity, okay, and at a lower cost. And his demonstration of this was a very clear one, and also a very compelling one, but it only held in the two-nation, two-product case. It was a toy model. Okay, but nevertheless, this toy model could be taught in economics classes all over the country for years and years and years. And a lot of people who took a basic course, okay, in economics, would learn this. Some people even in high school. And once they learn this lesson, it represented what you were supposed to do in trade, and it stayed with them for the rest of their lives. So a consensus developed on why free trade was better than any form of trade. Historically, this consensus was used against the mercantilist, the trading philosophy, which until the end of the 18th century was dominant. In other words, all countries were seeking their individual advantages in trade, and when they traded with other countries, the policies they followed were beggar thy neighbor trade policies. Okay, and what they were mostly aimed at was getting gold, because gold was always valuable to finance foreign wars. So in building
Aha.
empires, it was very important to have gold, okay, to be able to afford the foreign wars. So that's basically what was going on. So anyway, Ricardo tried to show that there was a better way, and this came home to America following the great crash of 1929, which in part was attributed to the beggar thy neighbor tariff policies that we were following before 1929. We were fighting basically tariff wars, okay, with other nations. And this was said to have contributed very greatly to the crash of 1929. So during the 30s and during the post-war period, we appear to have learned the lesson that free trade is always better, even though Ricardo never proved this for more than the two-nation, two-product case, and there were problems with that proof. Still, it became the conventional wisdom that the free trade policies were always better. So we tried to follow those, following the Bretton Woods Conference, okay, at the end of the Second World War. And we're doing it for some time with a fair amount of success. And then during Richard Nixon's time, he was really in many ways a great innovator. And one of the things, okay, which he innovated was the idea of negotiating free trade agreements, okay, with other nations that would also protect the investors. In other words, if their investors wanted to come here, okay, and invest in our country, then there was a treaty to protect their investments here. And similarly, the other side agreed that they would protect our investments in their nations. Now, how would the protection take place? Well, what happened was the two countries agreed to submit any trade disputes if they couldn't be satisfied by local courts, okay, in each countries, to international courts, okay, of arbitration. And so there were arbitration agreements enshrined into these free trade, so-called treaties, in order to protect the investors from expropriation by foreign governments. Because you see, during this period, sometimes there were radical Marxist governments that took over, okay, communist governments, okay, or even in Mexico, socialist governments that were expropriating the property of American investors. Totally unacceptable, right? The Mexicans were nationalizing the oil fields in the 1930s. So we wanted to stop all this stuff. We wanted to protect our investors from new democratic regimes which took over, in other countries. So we concluded these trade agreements. Now, they were bilateral for many years, but then during the 90s, under Bush and Clinton, we innovated a trilateral trade agreement, specifically NAFTA, between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Where we protected the investors of all three countries through submitting disputes under a clause called the Investor State Dispute Settlement Clause, ISDS, which would constitute these arbitration panels of three judges coming out of the corporate sector to decide what the individual governments could do and were prohibited from doing under the treaties. And so NAFTA was kind of the first of these, but then they proliferated over a period of years, both in bilateral form, and then finally, most recently, under the later Bush, and the Obama administration, the attempt was made to negotiate giant multilateral treaties. For example, the 12-nation TPP treaty focused on the Pacific nations. That was the first of those they tried to negotiate. Then there was the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, which dealt with some, if I recall correctly, 26 nations. So that was bigger because it included all the EU nations also. But really, quite a percentage of trade of the world between the TTIP, and also the TPP. Now, both of those investments were focused a great deal on products, and materials. To some extent, they covered intellectual property also, but of course, we thought those protections for intellectual property were not sufficiently great. That is, our film industry wasn't completely happy with the result. Our drug companies were not completely happy with the result. So we set out to negotiate a trade agreement called the Trade and Services Agreement, which this time would involve something like 56 nations, except a couple of them have dropped out. I think it's down to 53 nations now, and they're trying to negotiate these. So in other words, a lot of the TPP nations, the TTIP nations, plus other nations, all combining in this trade and services agreement in order to decide what the trading relationships would be, among nations in services, and additionally, what protections for the investors there would be in this. So between these three trade agreements, they were going to totally bind governments from being able to regulate or to innovate new regulations that hadn't been seen before, to fully protect the environment, to control the prices of drugs, and to regulate pharmaceutical companies, to also restrict, what governments could do with respect to patent protections, and with respect to, to regulating the IP environment, all of these things were covered. And if you look at the three trade treaties as a whole, not just the TPP, but the TTIP and the TISA also, together, they were going to, to create a supranational governing structure that would constrain the legislation that individual countries and local and state governments would be able to pass to regulate businesses.
Giving up our sovereignty, truly giving up our sovereignty.
These trade agreements were going to severely constrain the consent of the government. They could have been applied to constraining the monetary sovereignty of nations, because after all, think for a minute. What if the Federal Reserve decided it was going to run some negative interest rates for a while because it thought that was best for our economy? Well, under these agreements, it would then be possible for a corporation, for a multinational corporation, not based in this country, but that had been operating with one of its subsidiaries in this country, and that had been investing in treasury bonds at a positive interest rate, to sue the United States because it could no longer get a positive interest rate from the Federal Reserve, but when it bought bonds, was now getting a negative interest rate from the Federal Reserve. Okay, so in other words, there were things they could do directly to the Federal Reserve in terms of monetary sovereignty, which with a little thought one could imagine or dream up. But of course, the people formulating these trade agreements just apparently never considered those possible effects. So, okay, so they were monetary sovereignty considerations, consent to the governed considerations. There were federalism considerations, because we have a clear boundary in the United States, well, maybe not so completely clear, but reasonably clear anyway, that certain spheres are for the federal government, but certain aspects of general welfare are left to the discretion of the state governments. In other words, it's the state governments that mostly have the policing role. So it's the state governments that mostly provide for the human welfare of their citizens in most instances. It's the state governments that run certain aspects of state administration according to their rules. This is written into the Constitution. The states have these rights because they have not been relegated to the federal government. They have residual rights. But these free trade treaties were going to bind the United States to a situation where the multinational foreign corporations could sue local governments for regulations propounded by the local governments that were going to cost the multinational corporations expected profits because they were operating in the local areas of the United States. And they were going to be able to get these international private corporate courts to perhaps rule in their favor to fine the federal government of the United States for lost profits. So here you would have a situation where the local and state governments would have the power to propound certain regulations and rules and laws which would cost the multinational corporations their profits, or their expectations, of profits. But then the multinational corporations could turn around and sue the federal government for those lost profits. And the federal government won't even have the power to go back against the states and say, hey, reimburse us, because these rights are guaranteed by the Constitution to the states. So either one of two things would happen. The judiciary in our country would rule that the trade agreements were unconstitutional because they were placing the federal government in a subordinate role to the states, which constitutionally cannot happen. Okay? Here, you certainly would have that situation because the federal government would be incurring fines based on the actions of the states. So, okay, if the power to cause fines is the power to destroy, it would put the states collectively in the position of having the power to perhaps destroy the federal government, except, of course, for monetary sovereignty, but it could cause great damage anyway.
Sure.
Okay, so we were talking monetary sovereignty, consent of the governed, federalism, okay, sovereignty of the national government, because Congress could be constrained and would be constrained by these trade agreements. And if Congress is constrained by the trade agreements, it follows democracy would also be constrained, okay, because the people would not be able to get Congress to realize the will of the people with respect to legislation of a certain kind, because that legislation might be in violation of the trade agreements. So a democracy would therefore also be constrained. So we have federalism, we have also democracy, we have the monetary sovereignty, okay? We have also democracy. And then finally, we have a problem with the separation of powers. Why would there be a problem with the separation of powers? Because within our separation of powers, all disputes that affect things in the United States have to sooner or later go through Article 3 courts. What are Article 3 courts? Article 3 of the Constitution specifies the functions of the judiciary. The whole court system is based on Article 3, and Article 3 governs all the public courts inside of the United States. That's why they're known, okay, as Article 3 courts. The Supreme Article 3 court is the United States Supreme Court. Okay, but according to these trade agreements, if it were found by a private international court that it was appropriate to fine the United States a certain amount of money for violating the trade agreement, how can that be the case without violating the supremacy of the Article 3 courts? In other words, that would have to be subject to review by the Article 3 courts, because there cannot be any parallel court system according to the Constitution of the United States. Okay?
I want to take 2 seconds
according
here.
to the TPP, okay, these decisions by the international private courts are not subject to any other authority. The supreme authority is these private international courts. So that means, according to the trade agreement, you can't take the case to Article 3 courts, work your way up to the Supreme Court, and get a decision from the Supreme Court about whether the decision of the private court was a just one or not. No means of appeal through to the Supreme Court. But the Constitution says that has to be the case. It says the Article 3 courts have to be supreme, and no parallel court system is allowed. The TPP set up a parallel court system. Therefore, the likely fate of the TPP, if they had passed it, and the TTIP, and the TISA, and by the way, NAFTA ought to be challenged on these grounds too, okay, is that someone would take a decision of the private international courts into our Article 3 courts on grounds of the unconstitutionality of the trade agreement.
What you've told me.
There's a possibility that the Supreme Court could overturn those trade agreements. I mean, it ought to. If logic counts, it ought to, because they've definitely set up a parallel court system here.
Amen. I just want to interject here because there's some people in the audience that are really, really loving what you're saying, but they're also, this is a first time. I assure you, most people have no clue that the TPP and these other trade agreements went this far to affect us. They really just thought about it as losing jobs, right? That was probably about as far into it as most individuals got in terms of understanding.
There were three things that were heavily pushed in terms of the trade agreements. With the loss of jobs, human rights violations, and fair trade violations. Those were the three things. In other words, failure to protect us against the currency manipulators. That was a big thing also. So those are the three big arguments against it. Okay. And of course, there were the labor unions because it further weakened their position in the labor market here. Okay. So, but for most of the campaign against the TPP, very few people were arguing on grounds of sovereignty. Nobody was arguing also the monetary sovereignty point, okay, that I raised. There were a few people who talked about the violation of separation of powers, and a few people who talked about the consent of the governed. But by and large, these governmental impacts, which I've talked about, didn't receive a lot of press. And they were the most important impacts of the TPP. Because if we don't have the integrity of our democracy, and we don't have the integrity of our government, our system of government, then what do we have? When anything threatens that, it should be a deal breaker from the get-go. Forget about the loss of jobs. Forget about the currency manipulation. Forget about those other extremely important issues. The most important issue in terms of these trade agreements was that they take our system of government away from us. That's what was really bad. So my book, The Declarations of Dependence, addresses this, in detail. And my other book, Who Needs Balanced Trade? Who Needs Balanced Budget? That addresses different models for trade policy. The free trade model, the balanced trade model, the fair trade model, and the trade for public purpose model. By the way, there are two fair trade models. And then finally, is the trade for public purpose model. And that's an original model that I advanced. You wouldn't have seen it anywhere else.
We will put up links for all these books afterwards. For folks that want to read these books, we will definitely be including them in the links that go with this. Joe, we're over time, but I want to talk to you about something that is near and dear to my heart. And, I have my own kind of spin that I've been putting on it. And I've been kind of taking my own version of public purpose, my own stack of, you know, stack of policies that I want to push forward that are very, very similar to Bernie Sanders, but I do break from there in some respect. And I want to kind of run this by you. I'm open to critique here. So, you know,
Sure.
I obviously believe that we're a monetarily sovereign nation, that we have the power to do great good with our currency, that we have the
Okay, now
power to.
let's stop right there. Okay, just for
Sure.
a minute. Let's stop there. The first dimension or aspect, okay, of public purpose that I list in my books is maintaining or creating the monetary sovereignty of nations who are parties to trade agreements. That's the first dimension of public purpose. Anyway, go on.
Okay. So, and that's a great point, and I'm really glad you said that. So the next piece to this is this: when we talk about losing jobs, we are not living in the industrial era anymore. We are not trying to revive 1920s steampunk, you know, kind of industrialization. In my mind, the public purpose looks a lot more like self-actualization, looks a lot more like serving the public purpose and serving the public good, fixing our decrepit infrastructure, fixing our healthcare system, fixing our energy grid, things that are different. It's a new model. It's not the old 1920s sweatshops that people seem so hell-bent on bringing back to this country, twisting ties on Hershey bars, you know, all that stuff. People have perverted what I'm saying and tried to make it seem like I'm some libertarian for free trade agreements, but I'm not that at all. What I'm saying is we have other work in this nation that has been left go for far too long, that has not been attended to. And it's not been because we don't have cash. It's because we don't have political will. We're still holding on to the past and running away from the future. And the future, in my opinion, revolves around serving the rebuilding of America, rebuilding our infrastructure, and putting people to work on things that are actually bringing about purposes of community and so forth. I'm not about bringing back the Industrial Revolution to America. I'm about bringing about new jobs in a new era where we're doing things that actually bring about the self-actualization of all Americans through a job guarantee, through medical services being taken care of as a right, through education being seen as a national asset, on and on and on. My idea here is that I would fully fund the states, and this is very radical. It's starting to sound like central planning, and I own that. But I would really like to no unfunded mandates at the state level. The feds give block grants to all the states per capita based on certain multipliers for varying conditions that may or may not exist, be it demographic data, be it ecological situations, whatever. And then provide them with the means so that you're not having a situation where Texas is luring companies away from Buffalo anymore with sweetheart tax deals and leaving rust belts all over America. My goal is to eliminate the ability to provide sweetheart tax deals and just make it so that we have the ability to keep people employed at a nice, reasonable living wage level across the nation. Now, mind you, I know there's details there that we don't have a lot of time to go deep into that, but just from a standpoint, is there anything that I said in that sounded remotely libertarian? I mean, it sounds very much like a centrally planned economy to me. I mean, given this 10th Amendment rights to the states to be able to use those block grants to affect whatever it is they'd like to affect within their public policy space, remembering the 14th Amendment, of course. I threw a lot at you. Tell me what you think. I mean, am I off my rocker?
No. But I think the reason why people were saying that you're some crazy kind of, of libertarian was because you were probably saying that you were not interested in bringing back certain industries which had gone to other nations who are now selling us various kinds of goods that we used to make here, uh, you were probably coming from the point of view that imports are real benefits and exports are real costs. And so it's better to have the real benefits, even if that's going to cost us money. Well, that's all right, because we can always easily make the money, okay, because we make the money because we control our sovereign currency, and we can always create the sovereign currency. Okay, so we make the money. But if they're making the real benefits, it's best to have them send the real benefits over to us. And those real benefits that they don't want to send over to us, then we can make those here, whatever those real benefits are. Now, there are a lot of those real benefits are not in the form of goods. They're actually community services,
yes.
Okay, of various kinds. They're infrastructure. Okay, they're different kinds of innovation that no other country, okay, is covering right now. That we might do here. And you're saying it's best to concentrate on all those things. And I agree, it is best to concentrate, okay, on all those things, and to have all those other things providing full employment. Because what the other countries are doing for us by taking over the manufacturing areas they have taken over, like manufacture of toys, okay, and things like that. What they've done for us is to free us up to do other things, and we've been blowing the opportunity to do other things. That's the shame of it. We've been given this great opportunity. All we got to do is employ people at a living wage while they get ideas for entirely new businesses, okay, and new innovations that can create new areas, okay, of the economy. And we're not giving them the space to do that, or giving them the grants to do that, okay, or giving them the means of staying alive while they do that. So, I mean, if other people want to do our work for us, that's fine. That's great. Let them do the work. We've got a lot of other things we can think of that we can do here that are just as valuable or more valuable. Let's get to that.
Thank you.
Now,
okay. One more thing, real quick.
What I said there.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, and that objection is, okay, or actually it's an exception, okay, not an objection, okay, but the exception is there are certain things, certain industries which are vital for further development here, for sustainability of certain kinds of development, all kinds of sustainability, environmental sustainability, climate sustainability, also defense sustainability. That we have to keep capabilities like that here in this country, even at the cost of subsidizing those when they can be done cheaper in certain other countries. Because the reality is, we do not have an international democratic government yet. We are far from it. We cannot absolutely trust our relations with other countries to secure us, to be able to safeguard those aspects of sustainability. So for that reason, we have to have some industries here which may be less efficient than those in other countries. But by and large, the better way you go is the way that you described. I mean, that's the better way to do it. That's the general rule. There are exceptions.
Absolutely.
There are exceptions for sustainability.
Sure. And you start getting into details, right? You start diving into details, and that's when you start weeding out the exception clauses, right? And that is, you're exactly right. And I would never suggest otherwise. The last piece to this is maybe the most important thing I want everybody to get from this particular conversation. And that is this. we need to tax. Taxes drive currency. Okay. So the issue is not whether or not we should or should not tax. The issue comes down to whether or not we make people suffer while we fight a tax war, when we can absolutely render the rich irrelevant and go ahead and give people these public purpose type things like single payer healthcare, free education, green energy, you name it, without fighting the tax war first. Income inequality is solved, and this is teeing up for my next couple of days, but income inequality is better solved, I'm proposing, by a federal job guarantee mixed with a big than it would ever be by just soaking the rich. Because if you tax the rich, the taxes are deleted. They're not redistributed to the poor. So with that in mind, you're simply taxing the rich. There's purpose to do that, but it's not to pay for things. And at the end of the day, the poor are still poor. The only way the poor become unpoor is either A, jobs come around, which the job guarantee fixes, solving for income inequality, and public spending that it's at the bottom that bubbles up because money naturally gravitates to the top. Money changes hands. It doesn't fall down. It rises. So if you spend into poverty, if you spend into communities, it's going to rise to the top. So the issue of solving for income inequality and the issue of actually solving poverty comes not from taxation at the top, though I'm not saying don't do it, lest anybody lie and say I said that. I'm saying that the people should not suffer because the act of taxation is a separate act from spending. Am I correct?
Right.
Or have I completely misstated?
We actually talked about that in our last session.
I've been lied about many times, Joe, just so we know.
Okay, at that time, those were exactly the sentiments that I expressed also. That we take care of first things first. And first things first are, we see to it that people have what they need before we worry about the leveling problem, or before we worried about the political problem of containing the political influence of the rich by depriving them of a considerable part of their money. After all, we may be able to find some other ways to do that where we never touch their money. We just stop it from getting into the political system.
Amen.
Okay? And I think actually, by and large, if they don't get into the political system, we don't really care if they have their money, because we can always create new money
Amen.
to replace their money and the functions of their money. So we don't need their money. All we want to do is stop it from screwing up the rest of us.
That's right. So, Joe, I lied to you. I'm going to ask you one final question, and then I'll let you get on to the rest of your night. When we talk about, the whole 1970s tax and spend liberal, the whole concept of tax and spend, Bernie still parrots some of the stuff, which is disappointing. I'm not going to lie. But many of the people who are quote unquote progressives have not divorced themselves in any way, shape, or form of the old model. And they don't understand that this is not so much a value system as a functional, we talk the public purpose on one hand, which is, I would say, income inequality or equality would be a public purpose kind of policy. We value this.
Yes, that is also another one of my 33 dimensions of public purpose. When we get through, as well as sending you the links, I'm going to send you the 33 dimensions, okay, of public purpose as well. Okay, so you can post that.
Excellent. Excellent.
So it makes the idea of public purpose much more specific.
Excellent. So, all right, Joe. Well, I'm going to announce this. It's not we don't have a date specific yet, but I want to let you all know that offline I spoke with Joe, and Joe is a very gracious man, a beautiful soul. Joe, don't blush, but I mean this for real. And he has offered to come back on a recurring basis so that we can take these deeper dives into these deeper issues. And I'm always going to try and make sure that the things that we discuss work hand in hand with the things we discuss with Ellis and our other guests. I want to give you guys, folks, we don't do this just for the sake of doing it. We're doing this literally, and Joe has the same belief. When we were offline, I told him, I said, Joe, I don't do this 7 days a week just for the grin of it. This is not like some pet thing. I want to change the freaking world. I don't care what you call me. I am an activist for economics. I'm an economic activist. Joe is an economic scholar and activist. I am doing this, they're doing this, not because they just have some need to talk into a camera. We want you guys to learn so we can change the world. The world. This is where the grown-ups kick off the training wheels and step up to the big leagues. Your personalities be damned, your pet peeves be damned, your personal issues along the way be damned. This is a straightforward, fact-based tool service that we're giving you guys because we love our country, we love our families, we love our kids, and we want to change it for the better. And we want to change it for everyone. And Joe is very much aligned with that. And that's something that to me, speaks volumes. And I just want to thank you, Joe, so much for joining us. And I look forward to setting up the specifics. Right now, we've done a couple Saturdays in a row. If this works for you, I'm game. We can always fix that offline if you want to as well.
It works.
But anyway, okay. Joe, do you have any parting words? You want to just go ahead and knock off?
Thank you, Steve. I'll be sending you the links, okay, and the list of the 33 dimensions, okay, of public purpose. And we can continue this Saturday after Saturday. It will be great fun.
Awesome. Okay. All right. With that, Joe, I'm going to say thank you very much, sir. Folks, this is Steve Grumbine with Real Progressives. Please do me a favor. Donate to our Patreon account. Help us continue to build our network and build our tools. Help us to increase the quality of our programming. Help us to be able to activate. I'm going to be trying to put together a march for economic justice on April 15th, 2017. We haven't decided where we're going to do it yet, whether it's going to be at the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, the Capitol, I don't know. But wherever it is, I'm going to try and get some of these folks to join me in raising our fist in the air and fighting the power so that we can take back the public purpose and we can go ahead and begin to serve our communities. And with that, I'm going to sign off.
Purpose, but also the public purse.
Oh, yeah. Yes, the public purse. Exactly. Anyway, with that, folks, I'm going to sign off. Steve Grumbine, Joe Firestone. Have a great night, everybody. All right.